Someone convinced you to buy something you didn't need, this week. Someone made you feel guilty for saying no to something you had every right to refuse. Maybe an ad, maybe a person, maybe both. And you probably didn't notice, because manipulation doesn't look like manipulation, while it's happening. Psychologists have spent decades cataloging exactly how it works. Today, we're going through 7 of the most common tactics, used on you, every single day. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You've fallen for at least one of these tactics, probably this month. Not because you're gullible, but because these techniques are engineered to bypass conscious thought entirely. This isn't a character flaw. It's how human attention actually works, under pressure. They work on smart people, skeptical people, people who pride themselves on not being manipulated. That's exactly why they still work. Once you know the name of what happened to you, you can't unsee it. Much of what we know about these tactics comes from psychologist Robert Cialdini, who spent years studying salespeople, fundraisers, and negotiators, to understand what actually changes people's minds. He didn't just theorize, he trained as a salesman, a fundraiser, and a telemarketer himself, to document these tactics from the inside. Cialdini later organized his findings into what's become one of the most cited frameworks in marketing and social psychology. You'll recognize every one of them, the moment you hear them named. Decades later, his findings are still considered some of the most replicated in social psychology. Here are 7 of the tactics built on those principles. Tactic 1, Reciprocity. When someone gives you something, even something small and unasked for, you feel an almost automatic pressure to give something back. Marketers exploit this constantly, a free sample, a small favor, a compliment, before asking for something much larger in return. Cialdini documented one striking example: members of a religious group would hand travelers a flower at airports, before asking for a donation. Even travelers who threw the flower away moments later, still gave money, far more often than those who were simply asked outright. In one often cited study, waiters who left a single mint with the bill increased their tips by over 3%. 2 mints, and tips nearly doubled. Research suggests the obligation to reciprocate is so strong, it can override your better judgment, even when you know exactly what's happening. Tactic 2, Scarcity. Tell someone there are only 3 left, or that an offer expires at midnight, and desire spikes instantly, often regardless of whether they wanted the item 5 minutes earlier. In a classic experiment, researchers gave participants identical cookies, from either a jar full of cookies, or a jar with only 2 left. The cookies from the nearly empty jar were consistently rated as more desirable, despite being exactly the same cookie. Psychologists believe this works because we're wired to value what's rare, and to fear missing out, more than we value gaining something new. Retailers, dating apps, and even cult recruiters use manufactured urgency to shut down careful thinking before it starts. Tactic 3, Social Proof. When we're uncertain, we look to what everyone else is doing, and copy it. That's why ads feature crowded restaurants, 5-star review counts, and phrases like, "join millions of others." It's also why sitcoms still use canned laughter. Research going back decades shows audiences rate the exact same joke as funnier, when they hear other people laughing at it first. Solomon Asch demonstrated decades ago, that people will give an answer they know is wrong, simply because everyone around them said it first. Social proof doesn't need to convince you logically, it only needs to make disagreement feel uncomfortable. That discomfort alone is often enough to change a person's answer. Tactic 4, the foot in the door technique. Get someone to agree to a small request first, and they become significantly more likely to agree to a much larger request later, even one unrelated to the first. Researchers Friedman and Fraser demonstrated this in the 1960s, asking homeowners to display a tiny sign, then later asking a separate group to install a massive, unattractive billboard on their lawn. Those who'd agreed to the small sign first, said yes at dramatically higher rates. You'll recognize the modern version instantly, a free newsletter sign-up, followed weeks later by a paid upsell you didn't originally plan on buying. But the next three tactics aren't about products. They're about people, and they're far harder to walk away from. Tactic 5, the door-in-the-face technique. This one works in reverse: open with an enormous, unreasonable request, expect a no, then follow up with a smaller request, the one you actually wanted all along. In Cialdini's original study, students asked to volunteer at a youth detention center for 2 hours weekly, for 2 years, almost universally refused. But when that same request was immediately followed by a single 2-hour outing, agreement rates nearly tripled. Compared to the initial demand, the real request suddenly feels generous, even though it was the target the entire time. It's the same principle salespeople use, when they mark a price up, just to offer you a discount days later. Tactic 6, love bombing. Overwhelming someone with affection, attention, and grand gestures, early in a relationship, far faster and more intensely than trust would normally allow. It feels euphoric, which is exactly the point. The term itself comes from research into cults and coercive control, popularized by former cult member turned psychologist Stephen Hassan. Once someone is emotionally hooked, the same tactic frequently flips into withdrawal and control. Tactic 7, gaslighting. Repeatedly denying something you know to be true, until you start doubting your own memory, and your own judgment. The name comes from a 1938 stage play, later a film, in which a husband secretly dims the gas lighting in his home, then insists his wife is imagining it. Psychologists describe this as one of the most corrosive tactics, because it doesn't just win an argument, it slowly dismantles a person's ability to trust themselves. Once that trust is gone, every other tactic on this list becomes easier to use, again and again. Consider a pattern researchers describe often in studies of coercive relationships. Call her Sarah, a composite drawn from documented cases. Early on, her partner showered her with attention, constant messages, grand declarations, moving in together within weeks. When she raised a concern, he denied ever saying the things she remembered clearly. Friends who raised concerns were slowly cut out, described as jealous, or as not understanding the relationship. Small favors turned into obligations she couldn't quite refuse. By the end, she describes checking her own memory against a notebook, just to feel sure of what had actually happened. By the time anything felt wrong, the relationship already didn't feel like hers to walk away from. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. These tactics don't require a villain, they only require a pattern. None of these 7 tactics require someone to be a psychopath, or even to be acting in bad faith. Salespeople use scarcity without ever having read Cialdini's research. Partners love bomb without a conscious plan, simply repeating what worked for them before. These are largely automatic scripts, running beneath conscious awareness, in the person using them just as much as the person experiencing them. Which is precisely why blame rarely fixes anything, the pattern outlives whoever happens to be using it. Evolutionary psychologists theorize we're vulnerable to these tactics precisely because, in small trusting groups, they usually signaled real generosity, or real affection. In a world of strangers and algorithms, the same instincts get exploited at scale. This is exactly why intelligence offers so little protection. These tactics don't target reasoning, they target automatic responses that operate faster than conscious thought. Research suggests the people most confident they can't be manipulated, are often the easiest targets, precisely because they've stopped watching for it. That's not an insult, it's simply how attention works when it's divided between 100 other things. Confidence itself can lower vigilance, the same way a driver who feels like an expert is statistically more likely to stop checking their mirrors. Studies on persuasion consistently find that awareness alone rarely prevents the effect, unless it's paired with an active pause, before responding. That single pause is where every one of these 7 tactics loses its power. So what actually helps? First, build in a delay. Before agreeing to anything that feels urgent, or anything that came after a favor, a compliment, or a small yes, give yourself even 10 minutes before responding. Manipulators are counting on speed, because deliberation is the one thing their tactics can't survive. A single, "let me think about it," breaks foot in the door in the face, and scarcity, all at once. It costs you nothing, and it costs the manipulator everything. Second, separate the intensity of a feeling from the truth of a claim. Love bombing, gaslighting, and manufactured urgency all rely on strong emotion, arriving faster than verification. Ask what you'd think of this exact same behavior, from a stranger, instead of someone you already like. It sounds simple, because it is, the tactics rely entirely on you never asking it. If the answer changes once you imagine a stranger doing it, the behavior was never about the relationship, it was about the tactic. That question alone cuts through most of what we covered today. Now you know 7 tactics used on you constantly, and most people never learn to name. And once you can name a tactic, it stops working on you quite the same way. Not because the tactic disappears, but because you finally see it coming. The dark truth is, someone is using at least one of them, on you, right now. Subscribe. Because the next video goes even deeper.